everyone, it's Stephanie here and welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to be creating a card that was designed by design team member Keeway using products from the new December 2017 release. As soon as I saw Keeway's card, I was really excited to recreate it because it's a technique that I don't do very often, but I really love the look of. So we're going to do some stamping on black cardstock, and to do that, we're going to use pigment ink first. So stamping down with white pigment ink provides a base layer that is going to allow us to use some dye inks directly on that black cardstock as well. And you're going to see throughout the video that I make quite a few mistakes, but I decided to go with it, leave the mistakes in, and just kind of show you different things that you don't want to do so that you can get this technique to work nicely on your cards. So I'm starting off first with a card base here. So this is a black card base that measures 5.5 by 4.25, which is an A2 size card. And I'm taking one of the largest painted flower dies. So these are layering stamps and have 3 to 4 different stamps that layer together to create your finished flower. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the very base layer, which is the most solid of the stamps, and I'm using my white pigment ink and stamping this directly onto black cardstock, which is my card base. I'm going to do 2 of these directly on the card base, and then I'm going to do 3 more of them on a separate panel that we're going to die cut and add to the card with a little bit of dimension. And you can really see when I'm using this Sweet Tooth pigment ink that when I stamp it down onto the stamp surface there, it really coats that entire stamp, and it leaves us with a pretty nice impression on the black cardstock. It's definitely hard to get a nice white stamped image, but I find this pigment ink works really nicely. Now, first thing I want to mention is pigment ink is a super wet ink and it takes quite a while to dry, especially white for some reason. So you want to set your panel aside for quite a while to let it dry, or you want to use your heat tool to kind of speed up that drying process. So you will see I do that in a few minutes here in the video. So what I'm doing now is like I mentioned, I'm stamping 3 additional flowers onto a separate piece of black cardstock. And now I'm using that heat tool to heat set this so I can continue my stamping. And that will bring us to mistake number 1. This ink was not completely dry when I started to do the die stamping. And what will happen when you do this is the ink won't stick to the white pigment ink because the ink is still kind of wet. So what will happen is the die ink will kind of blend with the white ink. So you'll see on my stamp when I add the blue raspberry ink, it looks just like a normal translucent die ink. But when I open my MISTI door back up, you can see the white ink on my stamps. And you can't see a lot of that blue detail on the white. Now it does show up, so I'm going to keep going, but I could tell right away that my white pigment ink wasn't completely dry, so I'm not getting the full effect that I wanted with the stamping. Now I'm going to layer some additional ink with the Tropical Teal dye ink, and this is just going to add a little bit of a darker teal area, and I actually found that that added a little bit more color to my flowers. Now for the smaller one here, I'm going to do the pink color palette, so I'm going to use the Razzle first, and then I'm going to use the Cranberry Cocktail on top. And you can see here when I use the Cranberry Cocktail, it almost makes the pink almost blend in with the black, so it didn't kind of work out exactly how I wanted. Now this is mistake number 2. You can see on this panel, I didn't let the ink fully dry before I somehow smudged it, so I ended up with a bit of white ink smudged at the top, but I know I'm going to cover that up with one of the layering flowers, so I'm just going to leave it as is and continue to do the stamping. Now you're going to see the big difference here. This one is completely dry, and when I do my stamping with the pink ink, you can see how vibrant that pink color is against the white. Now I still picked up a little bit of that white pigment ink onto my stamps, which you can kind of see there on the right, but this one was definitely much drier and my pink really stands out against that white pigment ink on the background. I think if I was to do this technique again, I would give myself a lot more time and really let those panels kind of sit and dry. Even though I did heat set both of them and this one kind of sat for a little bit longer, I still feel like they could have dried even more. So now you can see side by side, the ones I did second have a lot more color than the ones I did first, but I'm going to go ahead and use all of these pieces and keep working on the card. Now I want to do some embossing to add the little spiral to the center. So I used my Magic powder embossing bag to kind of rub that over the images to kind of soak up any more of that wetness that might be left over. And I'm doing this because I don't want the embossing powder to stick all over those flowers when I add it to these little spirals that we're going to stamp. So I'm just taking Versamark ink and I put this panel back into my MISTI, and I'm just stamping those spirals to the center of each of the flowers with Versamark ink, and then I'm going to use my white embossing powder and add that to the flowers. Now at first it looked like it was sticking, but once I tapped on that cardstock, it fell off no problem, and I was able to heat set these and have those really cool spirals in the center. So once I have these ones heat embossed, I'm going to go ahead and do the spiral on the two that are on our card base as well. And once again, I use that same magic powder embossing bag to kind of take any moisture from those images. I stamped them with the Versamark ink, and then I added the white embossing powder. Now these ones still seem to be a little bit wet, and they did kind of cling on to that embossing powder a tiny bit. So before I did the heat embossing, I used a dry paintbrush and just removed any of the excess embossing powder on the stamped part of the images. For the leaves that we're going to add to the design, we're not going to use any pigment inks or the dye inks. We're just going to stamp these directly onto the card base, and I'm going to heat set them with white embossing powder. So once again, I'm using my MISTI to kind of pick up all of those stamps at once, and then I'm going to use my Versamark ink to do all of my stamping. Once I have these stamped onto the surface, I'll just use my white embossing powder to completely cover all of the leaf images, and then once again, I will use my heat tool to heat set all of this embossing powder. I really love the look of the white against the black. Any type of white embossing against black cardstock is just a really timeless look. It really stands out, and you get these really nice bold images. And I think it pairs nicely with the white embossing that we've added to the center of the flowers. So now moving on, we've done most of our flower details. I want to create the sentiment portion of this card. So I'm taking some Tropical Teal ink, which is the same color we used to stamp the flowers, and I'm adding this onto a cardstock panel, and I'm kind of creating an ombre look. Once I had that completely covered, I did die cut it with the U Trio Die-namics, so I picked this large U word, and then I'm also using the All About You stamp set to stamp the secondary sentiment. And once again, I'm going to stamp directly onto the card base, and I'm going to use white embossing powder to heat set this part of the sentiment. So I used my magic powder embossing bag once again and completely coated the area where I'm going to stamp the sentiment. And now I've just placed that U die cut so I can kind of line it up and figure out where I need to stamp the bottom part of the sentiment. I did decide to use my T-square ruler to make sure I have it nicely lined up before stamping it on there. And then I'm going to add that embossing powder and heat set this part as well. So once I have that fully heat set, and before I start to add my layering leaves, I'm going to take a white pencil crayon and just add a little bit of white color to these leaves. So I'm going to start at the base of the leaf, and I'm going to work my way towards the middle area. I'm not going to fully color them in. And this is just going to give them an even more white opaque look and kind of have them blend in with the look of the flowers, which have that white pigment ink kind of showing through from the bottom. And then once I have that done, I can start to assemble the card and add all of the die cut pieces. So I'm first adding the word U so that I can do some layering with the flowers. And then I'm going to take all three of the layering flowers and use foam adhesive to add them to the card. And I'm just making sure when I add them that I'm kind of positioning them over the ends of the leaves, so it looks like all of the leaves are coming from all of the various flower images. And then to finish the card off, on Keeway's card she used some Nuvo drops in white, and I didn't have those, so I decided to just use my white Uni-Ball Signo gel pen and add some little dot detail with my gel pen. So you can do either or. It provides a really nice look to, it almost looks like paint splatter. I really like the look of it. And the great thing about doing this is it allows you to kind of cover up any areas where some embossing powder ended up embossing that you didn't want. So it's a great way to kind of conceal those little mistakes. So that is the finished card. We had a few bumps in the road, but we ended up with a beautiful card once we were finished. I definitely recommend you trying this technique. I know it looks a little bit daunting and can look a little bit difficult to do, but it's actually a really beautiful look once you have your card completed. So thanks so much to Keeway for creating this card. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in another video soon.